Did you hear that?
I'm scared.
It'll be alright.
The first time I heard my name carried on the wind, I was standing just outside the old coal pit. The one they said was sealed shut for good. The pit's been closed for nearly a century now. After the collapse back in 1923 took 3 men, and the mine was buried under tons of rock and silence. Folks around here still talk about how the company never properly accounted for those who went missing, how the mine swallowed them whole and never gave them back. I was sure someone was calling me that evening, but when I looked around, all I found was the empty hillside and the quiet weight of things left unsaid. The farm had always felt a little strange. My grandpa used to say it was the mountain itself, restless and remembering. Even before the mine collapsed, folks whispered about odd sounds drifting down the ridge at night, low moans or distant hammering, like the earth was trying to speak through the rock. He said miners heard it too, long before the disaster, but no one talked about it openly. Since I was a kid, there'd been nights when the wind shifted, carrying faint noises that didn't match the usual creaks and rustles of the farm. Sometimes the porch light would flicker. There were no electrical issues with the house and no storms on the horizon to explain it away. Doors I'd swear I'd locked were found hanging open, and the old dog, usually steady as stone, would growl into the darkness for no reason. Most of it I chalked up to the kind of things that happen at an old place. Settling wood, the mountain wind, or just the mind playing tricks when you're alone. But lately those moments had been growing more frequent and more specific. It started with the voices. They were whispers at the edge of my hearing, barely audible like they came from underground. At first I thought it was the wind again, or maybe echoes from the river down below. But the night I stood at the coal pit, the whispers took shape. Simple names, common enough around here, but they weren't from anyone I knew. They sounded tired, almost sad, carried on the wind in a way that made my skin crawl. And then I heard it, my own name. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when my grandpa handed me a brittle newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. It told the story of the 1923 collapse, a tragedy that swallowed more than just men. Families lost fathers and brothers, promises were broken, and the company vanished without so much as a proper memorial. "There's more to this mountain than just coal," Grandpa said, his eyes distant. "Something that doesn't rest easy." Sometimes I wonder if the mountain is trying to tell us something, or if it just remembers better than we do. Because with every single restless night, every flickering light, every whispered name, it feels like the past is pulling closer. I decided to spend the next few evenings near the coal pit, hoping to hear those whispers again, or maybe find some explanation. The pit sits just beyond the pasture, where the trees start to crowd the mountain's base. It's fenced off with old rusted wire, barely holding back the brush that wants to swallow it whole. The entrance was bricked up over decades ago, but the stones looked loose in places, like the mountain was trying to push back. The first night I went out, I took my flashlight and a recorder, half to catch sounds and half because I wasn't sure I trusted my own ears anymore. The air was cool and still, the kind of silence that presses on your skin and fills your ears with nothing but your heartbeat. I stood near the pit's sealed mouth for a long time, listening. There was nothing at first. Then, just as I was about to give up, I thought I heard it. The faintest of sounds, like a breath on the wind. I leaned closer. "Michael." My blood ran cold. I spun around. No one was there. Only the trees, their branches casting dark shadows in the flashlight's beam. I checked my recorder. The playback was only static, no voices. I stayed until the stars were high, but nothing else came. The next day, strange things started happening on the farm. The old dog, Bear, refused to leave the porch, growling low and snarling at the wooded edge where the coal pit lay hidden. I tried to call him inside, but he just glared at the shadows, his hackles raised. That night, the kitchen window rattled like someone was pounding against it. But when I looked out, there was nothing there. The wind was dead calm. I started to wonder if I was chasing ghosts. On the third night, I returned with more gear, a handheld EMF meter Grandpa found at a yard sale, and a thermal camera I borrowed from a friend who does hiking videos. I figured if something was off about the place, maybe the tech would pick it up. The meter stayed quiet, flickering only with the occasional gust of wind. The thermal camera showed nothing but cold shadows. Still, the feeling was different. The air seemed heavier, thicker. Then, as I was about to leave, I caught it again, a whisper, just barely audible, so faint I almost missed it. Michael. This time I didn't spin around. I stood still, letting the silence press in. Then the earth beneath me trembled just slightly, too light to be an earthquake, but enough to make the leaves at my feet shiver. I wasn't about to stay around after that, so I returned home. The next morning, Grandpa asked if I had been near the pit late at night. "I don't like you fooling around with that old place," he said. "Something's buried down there that shouldn't be disturbed." I pressed him for details, but he only shook his head. Old stories best left alone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mine wanted to be remembered. That afternoon, I wandered around the edges of the property, near where the forest met the field. The grass was flattened in strange patterns, like something large had been pacing back and forth. Bear followed close behind with his ears twitching. As dusk fell, I noticed a thin trail of smoke curling from the mountain ridge. It didn't come from a chimney, not from the old farmstead. I followed it cautiously, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke thick in the air. At the ridge where the coal's pit-sealed entrance lay, I found the stone slightly shifted. A faint glow pulsed from the cracks, warm and orange, like a dying ember beneath the earth. My breath caught in my throat. Suddenly the wind shifted, carrying faint voices, barely audible but persistent. "Michael, Michael." I turned and made my way back toward the farmhouse, the sounds fading but still lingering in the quiet. Inside, the porch light flickered again. The air felt colder than usual, enough that I could see my breath but not freezing. Bear stayed close, low growl rumbling in his throat as he stared at the dark corner of the kitchen. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling that something was there didn't quite go away. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find out there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe just the mountain and old memories stirring in the wind. But whatever it was wasn't ready to be ignored. The next few days passed in a restless blur. I kept finding small things out of place, tools missing from the shed, the old rocking chair on the porch turned slightly from where I'd left it, footsteps in the dirt that didn't match mine or Bear's. Each time I convinced myself it was just the wind or a forgetful mind, but the unease settled deeper. One evening I sat on the porch, smoking a cigarette as the sun dipped behind the ridges. The sky was a bruised purple, and the crickets were quiet. Out in the field near where the coal pit lay hidden under thick brush, I thought I saw a flicker, like a light moving between the trees. It was so quick I wasn't sure if it was real or just a trick of the dusk. I called for Bear, but he was tense, his ears pinned back, growling low toward the forest. Later that night, the whispers came again, this time closer, just outside the window, barely audible but unmistakable. I pressed my ear to the glass. There were names again, not mine, but names I'd heard in passing. Neighbors, old friends of my grandpa's, people long gone. The mountain remembers. I don't know if it's trying to warn me or if it just wants to be heard. Either way, I can't stop listening. That Sunday, I went into town and asked around about the mine. Most folks just gave me that look, half amusement, half warning, like they'd heard enough stories not to ask for more. One old-timer at the feed store by the name of Curtis told me something that stuck. Back when I was a boy, he said, we weren't allowed near that part of the ridge. Not because of the mine itself, but because people said you could still hear the men working down there. Sounds of picks, coughing, even a prayer now and then. My dad said the mountain took them in, and and that it don't let go easy. I asked if he ever heard the voices. He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "You hear enough wind at night, your brain makes noises out of it. But sometimes it makes the right kind of noises, like a name or a song you didn't know you remembered." I didn't sleep well after that. The last night I went out there, I didn't bring the recorder or the camera. I just stood by the pit as the sun went down. The brush rustled behind me, but I didn't turn. The stones hadn't moved, but the air felt different, like standing too close to a shut door with people whispering on the other side. I didn't hear my name this time, just a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. I haven't been back since. The pit's still there. The porch light still flickers some nights. Bear still growls at nothing. Maybe it's just an old place with old sounds. Maybe it's the wind and memory playing tricks. But sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I can hear it under the floorboards. Soft, tired voices humming through the ground. And I still don't know if I'm supposed to listen or not. That wraps up our first story. Makes you wonder, what were those voices? Spirits from the mine? Or something older that's always been in those woods? Let me know what you think in the comments. And while you're here, tap the like and subscribe button to hear more stories like this. If you've got a true scary story of your own, you'll find a link to send it to on screen. This'll be the only break, so let's get right back into the rest of the stories. I don't usually go off trail when I'm hiking alone, but I'd gotten too confident with the map, and I figured a shortcut over the ridge wouldn't hurt. It was supposed to cut maybe 2 miles off the loop, nothing major. An hour later, I knew I'd messed up. The slope was steeper than I expected, the terrain thicker. Every step sent dry branches cracking beneath my boots, and the sun dropped faster than it should have. I kept checking my compass, then my phone. No service, just my luck. I wasn't panicked, not yet. I had daylight, water, and decent gear, but I was definitely somewhere I shouldn't be. That's when I saw the smoke, thin and pale, curling between the trees just ahead. Too steady to be a forest fire, too faint to be from anything large. Maybe someone's camp, I thought. A hunter, a cabin, something. It took another 10 minutes to reach the clearing. What I found wasn't a cabin. It was a house, an old one, sagging and damp looking, with warped siding and a roof patched up with scrap metal, and what looked like plastic sheeting. A rusted pickup sat half sunk in the ground to one side, its bed filled with chopped wood and what looked like pieces of fencing. Smoke puffed from a crooked metal chimney, indicating someone was home. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. Everything about the place told me I shouldn't be there. It wasn't just that it looked abandoned and lived in at the same time. It was the feeling that it wasn't meant to be found. I almost turned back right then, but my nerves were already getting the better of me. I told myself I was just being weird about it. If someone lived out here, they probably kept to themselves. I'd just call out, ask for a point back to the main trail, and be on my way. I took a few steps towards the front porch. The door was already open, not wide but cracked, like someone had stepped inside just ahead of me and hadn't bothered to close it. I raised my voice. "Hello, sorry to bother you, I'm a little turned around out here." There was no answer. I knocked on the frame, still nothing. I waited a few seconds longer, then pushed the door open. The inside was worse than the outside. It was dark for one. The windows were yellowed and coated in grime, muting the afternoon light. The walls were lined with handmade shelves, jars filled with cloudy liquid and what looked like preserved animal parts. Bones hung from the ceiling on twine, swaying slightly in the still air. Some were small, some weren't. A wood stove in the center of the room glowed with faint heat, and there was a pot that sat on top, bubbling slow and steady. Whatever was inside smelled bitter, earthy, not quite like food. There were no photos, no furniture besides a single chair and a cot in the corner. There was a child's shoe sat under the cot, old and cracked down the middle. I backed out carefully, heart pounding harder now. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't touched anything, but it felt like I'd trespassed, like I'd looked at something I wasn't meant to see. Back in the clearing, I turned toward the slope, thinking I could backtrack and swing north until I found the old service road that ran along the ridge. But 5 minutes later, as I pushed through the brush and came over a slight rise, I froze. It was another house, not the same one. This one was smaller, darker, with thick curtains pulled over the windows. A dull orange glow flickered behind one. There was no path between them, no driveway, no fence. Just wilderness. And then movement. A figure standing still behind a split log fence, maybe 20 yards off, barely visible in the brush. They were thin, pale, wearing clothes that looked handmade, and just watching. I didn't call out this time. I just stood there. Whoever it was didn't move, didn't wave, didn't shout, just watched me through the thin gaps in the fence. I could barely make out their face, but I knew they were looking straight at me. I turned and kept walking, faster this time, trying not to look like I was running, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to pick up speed. I thought about calling for help, but I still had no signal. Just one blinking bar that vanished every time I unlocked the screen. I made it half a mile before I started recognizing trees I had already passed. A deadfall with moss growing in a jagged split. A cluster of old cans nailed to a trunk like a makeshift target. I was going in circles. I stopped again, trying to breathe, to think. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, breaking twigs just out of sight. I spun around, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't animals. Deers don't follow you this way. They bolt. They disappear. This was different. Whoever it was, they were keeping to cover, on purpose. I picked a direction that sloped upward, figuring if I could reach the ridge, I might see something familiar. Even a tower or a power line. But the trees only thickened, and then, through a gap in the brush, I saw a third house. This one was worse than the others, lower to the ground, partly collapsed on one side. A wheelbarrow full of meat sat out front, covered in flies. What kind of meat I couldn't tell. It was pale, skinned and split into long ropey sections. A woman stepped out of the house just as I ducked. She wasn't young, gray hair pulled tight behind her head. She held something in her hand, long, glinting. Not a gun, a tool maybe a cleaver. I couldn't see her eyes, but I didn't need to. She turned her head the way someone does when they already know where you're standing. I didn't wait. I broke cover and ran. Not in any specific direction, just away. I must have run a mile before I stopped. My legs were shaking, my shirt stuck to me with sweat, my mouth dry and tasting of metal. I still had no signal on my phone, still no sound except the wind in the trees and the distant snap of a twig now and then, like someone walking a careful pace. The sun had dropped below the canopy. Shadows stretched longer now. Every part of the woods looked the same, and the worst part was I wasn't sure I was getting any further away. Something about the layout, those houses, the paths or lack of them between. They didn't line up in a way that made sense, like I'd wandered into a patch of forest that didn't follow the rules. I started moving again, slower this time, trying not to make noise. That's when I smelled the smoke again. Not from ahead of me, but behind. It was stronger now, thicker. Not like a chimney, more like something burning where it shouldn't be. I risked a look back. There was no fire that I could see, but something was moving. It was more than one person, walking through the trees at a steady pace. No flashlights, no calls, just the rustling of the brush, the occasional low crack of something wooden. I turned and ran again. My legs weren't going to last much longer, but I didn't care. I sprinted through brush and branches, stumbling more than once until I came to a gravel trail. An actual man-made trail. I didn't stop. I followed it, heart in my throat, praying it would lead somewhere real. Half an hour later, I saw the back of a Forest Service gate. Beyond it, a parking area. There was my car. I didn't question how I ended up back where I started. I just got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I saw a gas station and working lights. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I got lost and came across a few strange houses? That people followed me without a word? It doesn't amount to much, but sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I catch the faintest scent of wood smoke. And even now I find myself watching the tree line longer than I should, half expecting someone to be standing there just out of sight. I wasn't trying to find anything strange, just good light and interesting texture. The Appalachians have that in spades. Half-collapsed barns swallowed by kudzu, rusted-out trucks older than I am, forgotten things. I'd planned to shoot abandoned structures for a photo essay and maybe get enough material to justify a grant. Black Hollow wasn't on my map, not the paper one I kept folded in the dash, and not the one on my phone either, which lost signal the moment I crossed the creek at the base of the hill. I'd taken a detour off a Forest Service road, followed a gap in the tree line I thought might lead to an old settlement or hunting cabin. There was a string across the trail entrance, but other than that, no other warnings or signs. After half an hour hike, I found a stone foundation and a steeple that barely cleared the trees. The building slouched low into the earth like it had given up decades ago. It was a church, or at least it had been. The roof had collapsed towards the back, and one of the wooden doors hung half off its hinges. I should have left then. Something about the angle of it all, the way the force bent slightly away from it, felt wrong. Not haunted exactly, just watched. But that's what I was there for, wasn't it? Decay, history, the mood you only get when something's been left behind for too long. Inside, the church was still. There were no bird songs, no wind, just the faint buzz of flies somewhere deeper in the building. Pews sat in uneven rows, some rotted through and sunken into the dirt floor. Everything smelled like wet stone and ash. Light filtered in through the broken roof, catching dust and cobwebs in slow, heavy beams. On the far wall, behind where the pulpit should have been, there was a massive hand-carved symbol. It looked like a tree at first. Then, the longer I stared, the more it resembled roots reaching up, not down. Someone had painted over the carving in black, long dry by now. But the shape was still visible. It made the hair on my arm stand up. I took a few photos, adjusting my lens as I moved down the aisle. Beneath one of the pews, I found a bundle of old paper tied with twine. They looked like sermon notes, maybe. Most were half decayed, but I could still make out the handwriting, spidery and slanted. It said, "Let no voice be raised, for silence brings purity. The outside world carries rot in its breath. We wait, we watch, we keep the hollow clean." Another note, scrawled more frantically, said, "They heard it again last night, beneath the floor. She says it's his voice. I only hear the grinding." I pocketed the bundle of papers and moved toward the back of the church. A warped door stood at the rear corner near the fallen roof, swollen from moisture and nearly fused with the frame. It took a few shoves with my shoulder before it creaked open, scraping the stone floor like a warning. The room behind it was small. There were no windows. It looked like a storage space at first, maybe where they'd kept hymnals or communion supplies. But the far wall was covered in wooden masks, dozens of them all hand-carved, all different, human but not right. The features were exaggerated, sunken eyes, mouths too wide, and no noses. A few were painted with what looked like red clay or dried blood. In the center of the room, someone had built a kind of raised platform using stacked stones. Animal bones littered the space beneath it, small ones. Squirrel, bird, maybe a cat. A strange smell hung in the air. Not rot exactly, but thick and earthy. Like something had been living in the walls and had only just left. I backed out slowly, stomach tight, throat dry. I told myself it was just some local folk tradition. Maybe the church had belonged to one of those isolationist spiritual communities. The Appalachians have plenty of them. Sects that vanished without leaving a paper trail. People who made their own rules and kept outsiders away. Back in the main sanctuary, I took one last photo of the root-like carving. My hand was shaking. I told myself it was just the adrenaline, but I couldn't get the idea out of my head. Those roots weren't just part of the symbol. They were the symbol. Growing up, not down. Like something buried beneath this place had been reaching. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. Outside, maybe 30 feet from the entrance. A quick shift of leaves. A crunch. I froze, crouched instinctively behind one of the half-collapsed pews. Through a sliver of the broken doorframe, I saw a movement. Just a flicker of motion between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it stood upright, human-sized, shaggy hair, hunched posture, long arms that swung strangely as it moved through the underbrush. I didn't get a good look, just enough to know it wasn't someone out for a walk. It was barefoot, dirty and fast. I waited 10 minutes before I dared to peek out again. It was gone. I stepped onto the stone threshold, eyes scanning the woods. Nothing else moved. I took one cautious step forward, and that's when it came again, closer this time. Just a whisper of movement to my left, and then another figure. It was standing maybe 40 feet into the trees. I saw its head tilt. It definitely saw me. I backed up, slowly at first, then faster, until I was back inside, shutting the warped church door behind me. It barely closed, but it gave me a few seconds to think. I didn't want to be in there, but something told me I wouldn't make it 10 feet outside without something happening. I looked around for a weapon and found a small rusted metal rod, maybe part of an old candle stand. I held it tight. I couldn't stay. The place was too exposed. There was no way to secure the door, and that whisper-quiet stillness outside felt like a noose pulling tighter every second. Whatever was out there had seen me, and it was waiting. I held the rusted rod like it meant something, like it could do anything besides give me tetanus. My breathing was tight and loud in my ears. I waited at the church's front door, listening. For footsteps, for breathing, for anything. But there was only stillness. I decided to just go for it. I threw the door open and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The idea of seeing something following me, human or not, just stopped me dead. I ran past the headstones, through the overgrown grass, and into the woods where the light bent wrong and the ground pulled at my boots. I'd marked my trail in, flagging tape, small notches on trunks, but now I couldn't see a damn one of them. Every tree looked the same, and the ones that didn't had things in them. I came to a sharp bend on the slope and stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I noticed it. A bundle of twigs tied together with some kind of black thread, suspended from a branch about shoulder height. It was shaped like a figure, crude, human-shaped, arms extended. I stepped to get a closer look. The twigs were dry, but the string holding them together was damp, almost tacky. Smelled like rusted metal and earth. Another one hung a few trees down, and then another. There was more than one effigy, each one a few trees apart. They were making a path that led somewhere. I veered away from them, but the woods gave me more. Small circles of willow branches, bent and braided into strange loops and eyes and symbols. Some hung from trees, others staked into the forest floor, half buried in moss. One was ringed with feathers, black, white, and mottled red, fastened with tiny bones. It was like walking through someone else's story, one I wanted no part of. I pushed deeper into the forest, heart hammering, trying to angle back toward the road. The ground dipped suddenly and I slipped down into a shallow ravine, hands scraping on stone. And when I looked up, there it was again, a figure, human-shaped and lean, standing behind a tree, one hand resting against the bark, its face angled like it was listening. I ducked behind a fallen log, trying to still my breath. I couldn't tell if it saw me. I waited a full minute and then I bolted. Not back toward the church, not toward the effigies, simply away, anywhere else. I didn't get far. The woods closed in quick. Brambles tore at my jeans and snagged at my sleeves. Behind me, something moved. I cut hard down slope, lost my footing and went tumbling into a narrow ditch. The ground hit hard and jarred my spine. I stayed crouched there for a few long seconds, listening. Branches above shifted with a rhythm to them. Someone was still up there. I waited until I thought it was safe, then bolted again up the other side through tangles of fern and deadfall. My muscles burned, my legs were jelly, and then, suddenly I broke through a thicket of pine and stumbled straight onto asphalt. It was a road, rough, patchy, barely a lane wide. I didn't even hear the truck at first, just the low crunch of tires coming from behind. It was an old farm truck, faded green, with a cracked windshield and a rusted front fender. It rolled to a stop a few yards ahead, engine ticking over like it might give out. The driver leaned out. He was a middle-aged man, gray in his beard and around the eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just looked me over. "You lost?" he finally asked, like he already knew the answer. I hesitated. Every instinct told me not to get in, but the light was going fast, and there was no way I was spending the night out there. "Yeah," I said, hiking, got turned around. He nodded once, then thumbed the passenger door open. "Get in." The cab smelled like old leather and pipe smoke, and a pair of beat-up binoculars hung from the rearview mirror. He didn't ask questions right away. We just drove in silence, the road winding slow beneath us. "You weren't supposed to be out that way," he finally said. "That trail's been closed for a reason." "What reason?" He didn't answer, just gave me the slightest shake of his head. We eventually looped around and found my truck. Somehow I'd run in the exact opposite direction I thought I'd been going. I got out of his cab and turned to thank him, but the man was already putting the truck in gear. He paused just long enough to say, "You weren't the first to find that place. Just be glad you made it back." Then he pulled away, leaving only dust and the setting sun behind him. I never told anyone the full story, not because I was scared, but because I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else to know. There's something about that place that gets under your skin. Sometimes I catch myself replaying that day in my head, wondering what I missed or what they wanted. The symbols, the quiet figures in the trees, they've stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. Some parts of the woods don't want visitors, and maybe that's exactly how it should be. You have been watching Neon Noir, a Radion production brought to you by Spoopy Cola.